All right, so some of these should look kind of familiar to things you might have seen in introductory psychology, assuming you've taken that. This one in particular, Atkinson and Shiffrin, is probably something that you learned as the model for how memory works. It's a three-stage memory model. Some people call it the box model because Atkinson and Shiffrin drew it out like little boxes. So it makes sense that we would call it the box model. Now, you might not realize that there were rudimentary computers in the world in 1965 and before. They were like an entire room full of computer equipment, and they ran with probably at the time of Atkinson and Shiffrin, they were probably running with like switches that you had to flip for for the inputs. Like you had to physically flip switches. By the 1970s, they had these cardboardish, like cardstock kinds of things. Is not a very good description. It looked a lot like a Scantron sheet that you would use for taking a test in college, but instead of marking with a pencil, you punched out holes in a certain pattern, and that was the input to the computer. Like you didn't type on the computers back then. You had these inputs that were either switches being flipped directly or these, they were called computer punch cards. And you had to punch the card and then you put it into the computer and it could do whatever calculation or whatever it was supposed to do. But they were very slow and very cumbersome and so on. But so Atkinson and Shiffrin made their model based on these sort of antiquated now computers, the state of the art at the time. Computers don't really work the way that these computers did in the olden days, so it's kind of hard to see that model as a very viable model anymore. But here's the basic idea. You can see why they called it a box model because you have external events over here on the left, and then you have the sensory memory in the first box, the working or short-term memory in the middle box, and then long-term memory in the right-hand box. And so you can kind of imagine in modern times that between sensory memory and working memory is the encoding process. And for a computer, that would be typing into it, right? You'd be typing, or you'd be putting the computer punch card into it, or you'd be flipping those switches on the front of it. But in some way, external events are being transferred into the short term memory of the computer. In modern computers, there are screens. In old computers like Atkinson and Shiffrin's day, they didn't have a screen of any sort. But today, you would call the working memory your screen on your computer, the random access memory or the RAM, because it's whatever is being currently held. I just had an example of a demonstration of working memory in my computer because I had my external hard drive plugged into the USB port on my laptop, and then I decided, you know what, I'm going to go record these lectures in another room. I unplugged the external hard drive thinking I had already saved the material I wanted onto my laptop, but I hadn't. It was still on the hard drive. I came in here, got everything all plugged in. I started to scroll through the material that I thought that I had, saved, but it was only in the RAM. And so as I tried to scroll through it, it had the shapes of what it was in there, but it was empty. Like all the writing was gone. And I was like perplexed for a second. Then I realized, oh, the RAM memory is no longer attached to the long-term memory store, and so the computer can't really be displaying it. It needs to be continuously pulling out of that long-term memory store. The long-term memory store in a computer might take the form of, your hard drive that's in your laptop or in your desktop. In the olden days, you might have had a floppy disk or a CD-ROM, or maybe you even still today have USB ports that you carry around. My external hard drive is like just a big version of a USB port. Um, that's where a computer would store its memories long term. And so you can see where Atkinson and Shiffrin thought, well, if this is how it works in a computer, then maybe this is how it works for us humans too. That we have sensory memory that's stored very briefly, working memory that's stored longer but still temporarily, and then we have long-term memory where the material is stored relatively permanently. Anytime you want to think about it, you have to pull it back into working memory. Like that makes a lot of sense. The way that it works for a computer is probably also how it works for us humans. And today, because computers work a lot differently than they did when Atkinson and Shiffrin were doing this, for example, back in their day, if you turned off the computer in the middle of it working on something, it literally lost whatever you were working on. Whereas a computer today, when you turn it back on next time, it'll say, "Hey, you have some what do you call it? Unstored." documents do you want to save them? And that's not how your memory works at all. Your memory doesn't give you another bite at the apple. It's more like the old-timey computer where if you turn it off, it's gone. So some aspects of their model are better descriptions of how the human memory works. Other aspects probably are not that accurate. So we'll be talking about this model as we go on throughout the quarter. So what has happened to psychology since the decline of behaviorism? So psychology AD. Behaviorism provided the methods that are still used in cognitive psychology. You're going to find that probably the most behavioristic people you can meet outside of actual behaviorists will be cognitive psychologists, because we'll use a lot of behaviors that are objective and directly measurable to stand in for the cognition that's driving that behavior. So we might use reaction time to imply how long it's taking you to mentally process something. We will use experiments as our primary method of collecting data. I never did anything but an experiment until I left graduate school and started working with students and stuff like that, where we wanted to get stuff done a little bit faster. But experiments are our primary method to study cognitive questions, because we want to have a lot of control. We don't want to have any other explanation except for what we've done for the outcome. So we are very behavioristic in general. Humans are seen as active, that they are seeking information from this perspective, right? We assume that humans want to know and that they will look for information, again, that epistemological approach to the world, right? Well, like, we want to know how you know things. We assume that you want to know things. We assume that humans don't just passively react to the environment. We don't take the perspective that Skinner took, that we can figure out how to control your behavior by manipulating your inputs. Instead, cognitive psychologists tend to look at their participants as very active and very, self-oriented, right? Like, they're going to decide for themselves how to react. So some other aspects I want to throw out here and that we're going to talk about across the quarter: connectionism. Connectionism is this idea that, well, there's two different ways in psychology that we refer to connectionism. Connectionism, one way to talk about it is that your current explanations for things need to be tied to previous explanations of things. And that's something that we definitely, as a field, really believe. That in psychology, we think that, you don't come up with this new novel idea that's unrelated to anything anybody's ever talked about before. It needs to be connected to previous theory, previous data, stuff like that. And then in connectionism, there's another use of it, which talks about in the context of neural networks. You've got your neurons in your brain, in the cortex of your brain, and they are all interconnected in what we call neural networks. And there are certain areas of your brain that are focused in on processing certain kinds of information. Like, you got the back of your brain that processes visual information, visual memories, things like that. You got the parietal lobe doing touch and all those kinds of things, right? So within your cortex, there are interconnected networks of neurons that share little bits of information that give you your conscious awareness, your conscious recollections and stuff like that. So connectionism refers to this idea that these neural networks are connected to each other, and that what's happening in one neural network can spread out and have an impact on another neural network. And so here's a simple little neural network for you. You've got two, let's say, neurons that are green in this picture that got stimulated by the incoming sensation, whatever this information is. They're going to pass their information on to the neurons that they're attached to, that they have been hardwired to share information with, and then those are going to share their information with the next layer and pass the information on. And so you've got these patterns of interconnection, this connectionism that's going on in your brain. So you've got billions of neurons all interconnected with each other, and to some degree, there are neurons in the very front of your brain that are not directly connected to neurons in the very back of your brain, but they've got all these different intervening levels that allow them to connect with each other. When you're having any kind of cognition, whether it's a thought, or it's a memory being activated, or it's some kind of motivating thing, any of those things. Um, Cognition is a function of activating the correct nodes, right? So if you're trying to remember something, you need to activate that part of the neural network that contains those memories, right? And bring it all together in the correct way. So those the interconnected neural network is a great source of error, right? So if you activate one node and it starts to spread out to unrelated nodes, you may have a lot of difficulty recalling the thing you're actually trying to recall because your brain's off here thinking about some unrelated things, right? So cognition is a function of activating the nodes that are relevant to what you're trying to do. And a lot of times we have misactivation. The pattern of node activation determines our unique thoughts. So you've had those conversations where you start out talking about one thing, then you talked about something else, something else, something else, and you're like, how did we end up on this subject? We started off this conversation talking about X, and now we're over here talking about, D. How did we get here? That's a great example out in the real world, observable by both people involved in the conversation, of how interconnected thoughts are, right? Like one thing leads you to another thing in like one step, which leads you to another thing, one step away, which leads you to another. Now we are 4 steps from the original thought. Right. And that's how cognition is, right? So you can end up having very unique thoughts. You can have very creative thoughts. You can have thoughts no one's ever had before, thanks to the unique pattern of activation. Um, Cognition is thought to be a parallel process. I showed you those models before, and then one of them, the one in the middle, was the parallel processing model. We think that a lot of activity happens in separate neural networks simultaneously. Within a single neural network, probably not. So if you've got a single neural network that's devoted to the concept of red, which might be a color, it might be something that you did to a book in the past tense, it could be a lot of different things. That's a single neural network with a bunch of nodes that are all connected to the same basic concept, right? You probably can't be thinking about multiples of things within that neural network at the same time, but you probably can be thinking about that issue in that neural network. Another neural network might be taking care of tracking or responding to something else. You can have in parallel across neural networks, but not within them, is what we mean by that. So this is kind of like very much a nutshell of how cognitive psychology really looks at how information is processed. Now, cognitive neuroscience is a newer area, and by newer I mean, like the last 40 years. New is a relative term, but cognitive neuroscience really examines this idea that different structures in the brain underlie specific functions. And so they've studied it historically by looking at people with brain lesions. Here's a person who's had a stroke, and so they've got part of their brain has actually died. And so when you look at the actual brain and see where there are missing neurons, and then you look at the person's behavior while they were still alive, and you go, okay, we're here are the behavioral deficits. Here are the parts of the brain that are damaged. Let's put it together and see which part of these behaviors might be attributable to this damage that's occurred in the brain. This brain, I can tell you, we're looking at the left side of the brain. The part of the brain that looks the most damaged in this brain looks like it's right about Wernicke's area. So this person probably had trouble understanding spoken language. Another way that cognitive neuroscience looks at these structures that underlie specific functions is by using a procedure called an fMRI. So it's a regular MRI that involves magnetic imaging. And then they use a computer to colorize the brain based on how much blood flow was occurring in different regions. And when you look at this picture, it looks like, oh, well, there's the parts that were blue and there's the parts that were red, orange, yellow, and then everything else, nothing was being used. In the parts that are gray, what the fMRI computer software does is it cancels out any activity that is seen in the brain during other activities rather than the target activity. So let's say our target activity in this particular case is recognizing faces and naming them. So it takes out any activity that is present other times, not naming faces, and focuses in on just those parts that are specifically active only during the recognizing the faces and naming them activity. So you see a lot of activity in the back of the brain where the visual cortex is. You see a lot of activity on the right side of the brain where facial recognition occurs. And you see a lot of activity on the left side of the brain where, um, you know, hearing spoken language might occur. And then you see some in the very front, in the vague region of Broca's area for producing language. I don't know what they're really doing in this fMRI. I just kind of made up the task to to explain why they would have the. What I'm telling you as far as what is active is true. The part of the brain that is used for vision is highlighted. The part that's active in facial recognition is blue on the right hand side, and you see some auditory activity on the left hand side. So maybe that's what I don't know what they were doing in that activity, but we can look at these and get some ideas about which parts of the brain are more active. Both of these are imprecise. EEG is imprecise also. This is a technique where we put electrical collecting nodes on your head. So it's not stimulating you, it's collecting the information from the brain. And under each of those white little circles, it's collecting the electrical activity that's underneath. And the idea is that your brain is electrical, and so as the neurons are firing, these no these electrical conduit things will pick up the stimulation coming up from the brain and can print it out in a EEG, which is an electroencephalogram, and it'll tell you what parts of the brain, which regions of the brain were the most active. The highlight says EEG, that's an electroencephalogram. So that's the printout part. The ERP, we call them ERPs, that's a evoked response potential. So maybe we tell her, hey, think of a word that is made up of 5 letters and would tell you what time it is, and you're supposed to say watch. We've given you a particular task to do, and we want to see which part of the brain responds to that task, right? So that's an ERP. All of these are very imprecise. With the brain lesion, for example, there are probably other symptoms besides not being able to understand spoken language that occurred from that damage that we're seeing in that brain lesion. And it's really hard post-mortem to figure out what behaviors pre-mortem are relevant to what we're looking at now, right? Like, it's very difficult to put those together. The fMRI, unfortunately, a lot of people think that these are way more specific than they are. Lay people really like seeing fMRIs accompanying scientific reports, even when they aren't even relevant to the, to the scientific report. So we like them. We think they're really important. But in psychology, we are completely aware that they are very non-specific. Like, we see these particular parts of the brain that are lit up, but we don't know that that's because these are the critical structures for the task that's occurring, or if there's some kind of cascade effect, and these are like downstream effects of behaviors that have been emitted. Like, we're not exactly sure what comes first. And so the fMRIs are super informative, but they are not the end of the story. And the EEGs, even with the ERPs where we've evoked those responses, because each of those electrical conduits picks up such a large region, it's very imprecise. All we can say is that this particular region is involved in this activity. We can't say exactly which structure, and it definitely the EEGs do not go down deep enough to get at like underlying structures that might play a really important role. So please be really careful when you think about cognitive neuroscience as like being the answer to everything. It's definitely in its infancy right now, and so we're getting better, but we don't have the answers. That's for sure. All right, so that concludes chapter 1. I will see you next in chapter 2.